Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the host and senior editor of the American Public Media's Marketplace, Kai Ryssdal.
Wow, good morning. I'm sorry I was a little late on my cue for the stairs. You guys don't kid around when you start on time, do you? Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for your time and attention this morning. This is going to be an interesting conversation. It's a panel in two parts. As you can see in your program or your guide that you have there in your packet, it is a discussion of the vanishing middle class and then what philanthropy can do to help. The first 25 minutes or so, I'm going to be joined up here by Don Peck. He's an editor at the Atlantic magazine. He wrote an article in the magazine about, Don, come on up if you're just standing there waiting. Don't be late like me. He wrote an article in the magazine a couple of years ago about what the prolonged unemployment situation in this country is doing to America's middle class. He turned that into a book called Pinched: The Great Recession and what we can do about how the Great Recession is what? Narrowing our hopes, right?
Narrowing our futures.
Futures, and what we can do about it. We are going to talk for 25 minutes about that topic, about what has happened to the middle class in this country for the past 3 or 4 years, what the Great Recession has wrought, and then I'll be joined up here by Angela Blackwell and Jamie Marasotis for a discussion of the second half, what philanthropy can do to help, and what your all part in the American recovery is going to be. So, Don Peck, the first question to you is a scene setter, if you will. What is the middle class in this country? Define it for me.
Well, you know, everyone considers themselves middle class in the U.S. That's
Yep.
kind of the problem with defining it. You know, people with incomes of $400,000 a year often define themselves as middle class. You know, what I think of as the middle class, one definition of it, I define it kind of educationally in many respects. It's imperfect, but when you think about people who have a high school diploma but not a 4-year college degree, you know, that's about 2/3 of all adults in the U.S. It is the true middle class, typically, in the U.S. It's people who are working in manufacturing, often in construction, in non-managerial office jobs, in healthcare. This is the group of people who have really defined the American middle class for the last few decades. And it's this group of people, I think, specifically, that has really been hard hit since the crash of 08.
Right. 60%, 2/3 plus or minus, right? The Census Bureau says 60% of the people in this country make between $20,000 and $100,000 a year. There's another definition for you, just so we have it. As we sit here 4-something years after the financial crisis, almost 4 years now, why is this recovery taking so long? What's happening?
Well, I think there are two answers to that. I mean, if you really zoom back, financial crises, big crises, are always slow to get out of, inevitably. You know, there has been a huge amount of wealth lost, mostly housing wealth. Again, it's been mostly middle-class wealth. The middle class lost more of their wealth in this recession than did the rich, which is highly unusual because of housing. And, you know, the middle class in particular, for years prior to the crash, their incomes weren't growing, their paychecks weren't growing, and they had a sense of getting ahead because housing prices were appreciating, and people used that home equity to fund improving lifestyles. So now what we see, you know, housing prices are down, wealth is lost, debt levels are very high, and people are still paying down those debts. And I think, you know, there's a report by the McKinsey Global Institute indicated America is making progress paying down debt, but it's going to be another couple of years or so until people are really able to spend freely again. And I think that's when we'll start to see more of a recovery in spending. But part two of my answer is recessions like this one often leave permanent effects too. They accelerate trends that were already happening in the economy. And I think this is troubling for the middle class because what we've seen in the crash is the destruction of millions and millions of traditional middle class jobs. David Autor, an economist at MIT, looked at the structure of job loss in the recession, and what he found was just about all of the jobs lost on net, just about all of them, were in what he calls middle-skill jobs. And these are exactly the jobs that have provided middle-class lifestyles to people with a high school diploma, but not a 4-year college degree. So this is the real enduring problem with the recession. We've seen the middle class hollow fairly swiftly, And my fear is that those jobs will not come back. That we'll see, and we are seeing job growth at the bottom, job growth at the top, but much less in the middle, and that creates real problems for us.
Let's get into the social fabric, because this is a very condensed version of this conversation, just so we can get more people in here. But what happens in a society, in a society where the middle class has prospered for decades, when people are out of work for 23, 25, 27 months, when they can't make their car payments, and when, frankly, there's no hope of reemployment on the horizon, and the jobless rate is 8.3%?
Horrible things happen to society. We can see politically an increase in rancor. Already this happens again and again. I looked at the 1890s, the Depression, the 1970s. You see reliably when people are struggling for long periods of time, not just a year, not just 2 years, but as it gets beyond that, social problems tend to multiply. Family problems tend to multiply pretty severely as well. We're already seeing increases in domestic disputes, domestic abuse, in this period. Family formation is retarded, and people stop marrying, but they do keep having children. So you see communities...
Say that again.
Yeah.
Stop marrying, keep having children.
Yeah. And
fractured families, kids in trouble, all that stuff. Right?
All that stuff. And these are things that were kind of happening to, again, the true middle class already before the recession. They've been happening for 20 or 30 years, particularly as blue-collar men have struggled. And they've only accelerated since the crash, and I think this is of great concern, because when you have communities where unemployment is high, chronic unemployment is high, families are fractured, children are growing up in single-parent homes, that becomes an intergenerational problem. It's a problem we saw in America's inner cities in the 1970s when manufacturing suddenly left those cities,
right.
and kind of low-skilled black men in particular found themselves out of work. The sociologist William Julius Wilson has noted that it was really that loss of employment for black men in cities that created many of the social ills that followed and that have plagued many inner cities for decades since. Those problems are multiplying beyond inner cities to exurbs around Tampa, to traditional middle-class enclaves.
Is this, just because you've brought up men now a couple of times, is it what we can all imagine, right? It's the loss of prestige, it's the perceived loss of influence and power, it's embarrassment, shame, humiliation, and all of those things that go with a man losing his job.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone, people who are out of work involuntarily for a year or more, it's like the worst thing psychologically that can happen. It's actually the equivalent of a death of a spouse in terms of its effect on happiness. And men or women, but it tends to be more severe for men, particularly middle-aged men. They lose their sense of selves. They lose their social networks, so it's harder to find a job. And there's abundant evidence. Kathy Eden at Harvard, a really good sociologist, done a lot of work on this, that women in particular, they won't marry men who are struggling economically, who are unemployed. And so you just get this kind of, that has an effect on family, it has an effect on community, and you get this kind of downward spiral that becomes very, very hard to reverse after a time.
Let's say you're 21, maybe 23, whatever, however long it takes to get through college these days, and you're out of school and looking for a job in early 2012 America, and you're still not able to find one. What does that do?
That can have lifelong consequences. When I first started my reporting on the recession and the problem of joblessness in the U.S., I really expected that young people would bear the lightest scars from this period because they don't have debt, or many do have student
young
debt,
people are
but they don't have
right?
mortgages. They don't have mortgages. They,
Yeah.
they don't have families for the most part. But actually, history, the history of the Depression, and a lot of academic research suggests that it's just the opposite. The first few years in the job market, whether you're a college graduate or a high school graduate, are extremely important to setting your career path, setting expectations for employers. And there is very strong evidence that people who struggle early because they can't find work at all or because they get stuck in bad jobs, they not only start out behind, they never fully recover. Even after the economy recovers, they've got a perception of low potential or of underachievement. There are people coming up behind them with no white space on their resumes to explain. So Lisa Kahn, for instance, has shown people who graduated into the teeth of the early 80s recession, not only were they making 25% less than the cohorts right around them, but even 20 years later,
wow.
They were still making substantially less. They were stuck in low-status professions, and they were in many ways different people. They clung to their jobs more tightly. They had less confidence. So this period, the longer it extends, is really changing the life course of young people and making it very hard for young people to step up into the middle class.
We've had recessions in this country forever. We've had bad recessions in this country forever. Why is this time and the effects it brings so much different?
Well, I think the main reason is simply the depth and duration of the crisis. I mean, we haven't had a financial crisis like this since 1929. Right. So when you have this much unemployment for this long, it produces social, cultural, personal changes on an order that short recessions simply do not. But again, to come back to an earlier point, the other thing that's happening is this recession has accelerated trends that were already going on. And there's been recent economic research that indicates that in each of the past 4 or 5 recessions, what we've seen is, I said that in this recession it was mostly kind of middle-class jobs that were lost. That's actually been true of each of the past 4 or 5 recessions, and those middle-class jobs have not come back in each of the past 4 or 5 recessions.
Okay, so this is all depressing as hell, okay? And this is your moment to give it a little hope here. Surely something good happens when there are transformational changes in an economy like this. So help me out, man.
No, absolutely. I mean, what we tend to see in periods like this one, and we saw it even in the Depression. I mean, so incredibly high rates of innovation, technological growth in the Depression. We saw the same thing in the 1890s. So in these periods, old sclerotic companies fail. It releases capital. It releases people for more productive enterprises. Bill Gates goes into his garage and founds Microsoft in the 70s, a weak period. So you do often see a burst of innovation following periods like this one. And that can be very good for the national economy. And when the national economy is growing quickly, ultimately, that is good to some extent for everyone. So I think that is something that I hope will happen and that is likely to happen at some point coming out of this period. I think that's good news. I think culturally, when you look at young people today, I talk to a lot of people in the course of my reporting. You are seeing kind of a change in values to some extent, a return to thrift, to family values. And if history is a guide, that shift will endure throughout their lifetime. And I think that's a healthy change for the U.S. And the last thing, kind of for the purposes of this audience in particular, the changes that we're seeing to the middle class, the struggles of men, the breakdown of family in this demographic, right. The disappearance of these jobs, these are ultimately slow-moving phenomena. The middle class is still pretty big in the U.S., and this recession has helped us see, I think, it's helped us see the future. It's helped us see, by temporarily accelerating these changes, it's helped us see what's to come. So there is time, if we focus, to rebuild the middle class, to arrest these trends by focusing better on policy.
But I wonder if we have to redefine what normal is, right? We have to redefine the kinds of jobs we're going to have. We're going to have to redefine what's an acceptable unemployment rate. It's not going to be 4% the way it was in 2004. Not for years, right? We're going to have to get used to coin a phrase, a new normal, right? I mean, we're never going back.
I never say never, but I mean, I think if you look at the next 4 or 5 years in particular, I think it's highly unlikely that we'll get back to an environment like we saw in 2005, 2006. So yes, I mean, I think there is a new normal for the next few years. You can see your way eventually out of that. But what does that mean? I mean, I think it means that we need to focus all the more on education, and not just on four-year college. We should increase access to that, but we need to help students, high school students, find other ways into the middle class through an increase in kind of maybe technical skills, apprenticeships, and so on. We may need to focus. We need to focus more on helping people feel economically secure enough so that they are willing to marry before they have kids, so that those kids grow up in stable households. And ultimately, I think we may need to see and should see, an increase in support payments for people who are working, people who've fallen out of the middle class or can't climb up into it, who are willing to work, but who can only find what have historically been bad jobs. I think we owe that to people in the U.S.
You're not going to believe this, but that was not at all planned as a segue into the second half of this presentation. But now I think is the moment where we're going to get Angela Blackwell up here and Jamie Marasotis to talk about how we do some of those things that Don was just talking about, how we get people the access and the education and the means to try to get back into this economy and make it work, and what philanthropy can do for that. As they're coming up and getting seated, let me ask you guys just to scoot your chairs around so we can all sort of see each other. We're going to go half an hour-ish, plus or minus, and then take some questions. There are microphones, I believe, in the front of the room, so if you have a question about 9, 10, 9:15, come on up and line up, and we'll get your thoughts up here. And Angela, let me first turn to you and say, first of all, thank you for coming, and throw you the first sort of how do we do this question. Those things that Don was talking about, those policy issues, those education problems. There are so many things we need to do in this country. How do we do those basic things?
Thank you for the discussion. It was very interesting. The first thing we need to do is we need to change this conversation so that we're not talking about somebody else.
Hang on one second. Can you all hear her? Yeah? Okay, all right.
We're not talking about somebody else. We're talking about ourselves. We're talking about the future of the nation. The fact that the middle class is vulnerable and slipping away will redefine the nation. Mm-hmm. And as we're thinking about what the nation is going to be, we have to face the fact that the demographics that are changing really will define the future in some profound ways. I want to show a video. Mm-hmm. It was That was a PSA that we had running on Times Square for 6 weeks, trying to make the point that the rapidly changing demographics will define America's tomorrow. I want to show another video that's an animated map looking at the changing demographics from 1980 to 2040. And the darker shade represents areas in which 50% or more of the population is of color, and the slightly lighter orange is 30 to 50%. Mm-hmm.
That's great. Is there a way we can run that again, just because that went really fast? If we could just run it one more time. But please keep going with your thoughts. Yeah.
It would be nice if you could run it again. Yeah. There it goes. And what you're seeing is that some places where you wouldn't even expect it, you see the majority of people will be people of color. Already, nearly half of all children in this country are children of color, 46+%. And so when we think about the future, we have to understand that what happens to the people that this nation has been too comfortable leaving behind will determine what the future looks like. And so we've got to change our mindset first.
Jamie, how does that complicate your problem, right? Changing demographics in this country and getting people educated so that they can participate in this new economy that Don was talking about.
Yeah, from my vantage point, the way to see it is it's an opportunity for the country, not a problem. The point that Angela's making, which I really think is right on, is this is about collective well-being. This is about our shared future as a country. And whether it's Latinos, African Americans, which are the two largest disadvantaged populations, or whether it is, I want to come back to something Don was talking about, about the labor market, which is adults, another very important group that we've got to think about besides these young people coming up through the system. The point is we have to see their future as our future, and that shared well-being is terribly important when it comes to our role in philanthropy, because I think we have a major role to play in terms of informing and influencing the trajectory of the change that's necessary for our society, whether it's educational or labor market or social in some other way. The easiest way to think about the problem that we face is that we have both a labor market problem and an educational market problem. Yep. The labor market problem, which Don was talking about, is that we simply don't have the kinds of jobs that we had before, and we have this mismatch in terms of the educational system. What's most interesting is that right now, even in this kind of an economy, unemployment rates for people with higher educational levels are dramatically lower.
Oh, it's extraordinary, yeah.
And what's even more interesting and less understood is that the wage differential, the gap in wages between people with post-high school credentials, what Don was talking about, all the way up to and including the bachelor's degree, and those with high school and below is actually growing. What that means is that the labor market's paying a premium for people with these higher skills. So if you ever wanted any evidence that more education leads to better labor market outcomes, that's it. The problem in the educational market side is that we know about the problems of our K-12 schools. The problems at the higher ed level, though, are things that are now starting to come into very sharp relief, right? Affordability of higher education, which I've been writing about affordability of higher education since the mid-1980s. I've described this as the mood music for higher education discussions, right? It's every time we talk about higher education, we talk about affordability. Well, you know what? The music has stopped. And the music has stopped because of two factors. The first is government's capacity to invest at the levels that it invested in the past has reached a limit. Yeah. It is very difficult. Now, I argue for increasing government investment. I believe we need more government investment. So we need to make the case for that. But any rational observer of the state of our government, state and federal, would understand that government's capacity is now severely constrained. We also, however, have the other problem, which is families and individuals' capacity is now constrained, right? We've hit the max in terms of families' ability to pay. You know about the student loan debt problems, et cetera. So historically, what happened in higher education was the cost of education continued to increase, and we paid for it through one of two means: more government support or more family pay. Well, now the music has stopped, and the problem in the educational side is we've literally got to redesign the educational system, rethink how we deliver it, because we have such a gap in terms of the proportion of people who need those higher skills in the new economy that Don was talking about, that there's no way to deliver it with the current system that we have.
Let me get back to that point in a minute, but Angela, I want to go to you and talk about your group and what you do improving access to the economy, to society for people of color and people of lesser means. I know Don said he likes to think of this as opportunity, not a problem, but it does seem to me that you in particular have an immense problem. Given the education gap, the wage gap, the inequality gap, how do you turn your philanthropic and the best minds you have to that opportunity of getting your constituents what they need so badly to survive in this economy?
I'm going to start where I ended. The nation has a problem. The first thing we have to do is stop thinking that people of color have a problem, that people who are falling out of the middle class have a problem. The nation has a problem. The future is not bright if we don't invest in those people who are going to be the future. America can see its future, and you just saw it on that PSA. It's a 5-year-old Latina. It's a 7-year-old black boy. What happens to them determines the fate of the nation. And what we are doing is, one, trying to sound that alarm because the nation is in trouble. The next thing we're doing is really trying to underscore education. Clearly, early childhood education and K-12 education, absolutely essential. By 2018, 45% of jobs in this nation will require at least an associate's degree. Only 27% of black people have it, only 26% of Latinos. So we're really trying to work with community college systems, work with industry to be able to deal with that issue. We're working very closely on the education issue, but let's be clear about this. Many people who are being left behind live in communities that are being left behind. And infrastructure investments, infrastructure in schools, but infrastructure in public transportation, infrastructure in terms of making sure that communities really can be competitive in the 21st global economy, 21st century global economy. And I can't underscore enough how much we have to deal with the issue we don't want to deal with as a nation, and that is this problem of race. That if we don't come to grips with the fact that our racial divide has the potential to turn into a generational divide, the future is not bright. Our lack of connection across race, which allows us to see those children, their children, as something that's not quite us, has caused us to underinvest in education, to underinvest in public transportation, and feel that it's not happening to us. It is happening to us, and I mention it not as something that's nice to do. It's essential that we overcome the thing we have never overcome and understand this is happening to the nation.
When you... Absolutely. Absolutely. Well said. When you go up to Capitol Hill and talk to members of Congress on either side of the aisle, and they say, Angela, I believe in what you're saying with everything that I have, but have you seen the other things we have to do in this country? How do you make them not just to pick up on those little kids. Go la 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 because I have to deal with other things. I mean, how do you keep people focused on this thing without letting them tune out?
There's a little answer and there's a big aspiration. The little answer is that we have very good track record in terms of going up on the Hill and talking to both sides of the aisle about the programs like Promise Neighborhoods and the Healthy Food Financing Initiative that gets more grocery stores in underserved communities. Because those kinds of demonstration programs that actually help communities all across the country, we get bipartisan support. But where we're not getting it, and what we have to do as a nation, is accept that we are not a poor country and we need to stop acting like one. We have the resources to do what we need.
So, Jamie Marasotis, back to you. We're not a poor country. We have the resources to do what we need. Put up or shut up, man. How do you redesign education to make all this happen?
The problem, I share every single one of Angela's values. The problem is they don't believe us. That's the problem. The problem is the value proposition is, I think, part of the challenge. And I think for us in philanthropy, we have a responsibility to be able to help articulate what those values are. The value of increasing educational attainment is not about individual well-being. It's about collective well-being. It's about our shared economic, social, and cultural future. So that's one element. The other element, though, is we've got to get serious about improvement in terms of outcomes, in terms of performance. There is very good evidence, not only at the K-12 level, but at the higher ed level, that the kinds of education we're providing are inadequate for the economy of the present and the future. Look, for example, at the recent book called Academically Adrift. It's gotten a lot of attention about the limited amounts of learning outcomes that we can measure for students that have four-year college degrees. That's a serious problem in the labor market. Given the high cost of education, given the amount of money we're expecting individuals and governments to pay, if we can't prove that what students know and are able to do actually have relevance in work and in life, we have a serious problem. So part of our responsibility in philanthropy is not just to develop some of the best new ideas and hope somebody else is going to scale them, but insist that the best of those new ideas get scale through our own investment, through our own support for public policy, for our ability to influence the public's will for change. All of those things, I think, represent our responsibility in philanthropy. We are not in any position to supplant or replace governmental resources. I have these conversations with policymakers all the time, and they say, well, if you guys could just step in, we could fill in the gap. Of course not. Philanthropy does not have that kind of resources, even with all of the new wealth. What we can do is help facilitate that change so that the kinds of changes that we implement, where we can increase the capacity of educational systems to produce higher outcomes at the lowest possible cost, that's what we should be focusing on. And that's something that several foundations are now working on.
So let me bring you back into this conversation and ask you what seems like an obvious question, but I'd like you to drill down a little bit. What have the past 4 years in the economy of this country done to the politics of it so that we are having to deal with the problems that all of these people are having to deal with?
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree completely that these are problems that affect us as a nation. You know, if we don't have a strong middle class, if there's not hope for advance for most people, I mean, what is the U.S.? We don't share a common heritage. We don't share a common religion. So this is crucial for our national health. I think the problem right now is that what we see in periods like this one, we see it again and again and again, is that when times are hard, when people lose the sense that they're getting ahead, they become very jealous of their status relative to others. Politics tends to become more rancorous. It tends to become very zero-sum. So it actually becomes harder and harder the longer you're in a period like this one for government to act creatively, for it to make bold moves. And that's a conundrum. What gives me hope is, I keep talking about the 1890s, really a remarkably similar period to this one. Innovation just bounding ahead in some ways, globalization proceeding rapidly, all of that creating huge disruptions, a big depression, a lot of people struggling, very similar period. And what we saw in that period was there was a lot of ferment, there were a lot of private organizations, private individuals who were trying new things. There was a lot of national attention on the problems of the country. Those things became starker. Within that period itself, within the 1890s, none of that led to national political reform, national policy changes that were really what we needed. But when the economy got better, and really as soon as it got better. The attention and the work at the grassroots level really showed itself, and we had the progressive era and a lot of changes that took some of the harder edges off capitalism that really helped kind of ordinary, everyday people. So I mean, I think that right now we're in a time where, for psychological reasons, for fiscal reasons, it's hard for the federal government to do a lot, and I think there's a more important role than ever for the people in this room because of that. And I think that as time goes on, kind of private efforts will lead to public reform as well.
Angela, how do you see your role and the role of your peers in your part of this equation? What is your job now in this economy?
My job, and the job for everybody in this room and all of us who really care about the nation, is one, to really understand that we must focus on equity as a driver. When I use the term, all I mean is just and fair inclusion into a society that allows all to reach their full potential. Allows all to reach their full potential. If we do that, it will really sharpen our focus on the future. Because this notion of equity is no longer just the thing that we will do because it is the moral and the right thing to do. Equity becomes the superior growth model for the future. Because to the degree that we're educating everyone, that we have people ready for jobs, that we're unleashing and supporting the entrepreneurial spirit within communities of color and other communities that are left behind, that we're investing in communities so that every community, every region can participate in the global economy, we are really setting up a sustainable, inclusive growth pattern, which would be transformative for the nation. We have to lift that up. Then we have to put policies in place that educate, that get people prepared for work, that connect the innovative spirit in communities to the innovative needs of the future. You get 3 times as much entrepreneurial activity in Black and Latino and Asian communities as you do in the white community. But that entrepreneurial activity often isn't connected to the innovations of the future. We need to invest in that through small business and other things. The last thing we need to do is get our men out of prison. We have a scandal in this nation. We are locking up more people than any place else. And it's not just bad for those individuals and those families, it's bad for the nation. We're creating a legacy of absence in communities in which there are no men, and so you talk about marriage and fathering and work and all of those things. Most of them don't need to be there. That has to be part of this agenda. Equity. It has to mean include everyone.
And by the way, that also has an enormous governmental cost. The cost of incarcerating so many people in terms of those limited government resources we have, extraordinary.
Let me get back to your point, your first point about equity. And I hope, excuse me, you will take this in the spirit with which it's intended. We have the great luxury of being able to sit and think about these very, very difficult problems. By the time we get out of this meeting, by lunchtime today, 3 blocks away and 4 blocks north, there will be May Day protests going on. There will be Occupy Reminder protests going on. There will be people either skipping or taking sick leave or just dodging work to get out there and make their views heard. How do we make the people who will benefit from this realize what could possibly, the benefits that could accrue to them? Because they are so busy getting by that they literally don't have time to think about what happens next.
They're thinking about what happens next every moment because getting by puts you on the edge. We don't need to worry about the people who are getting by. They know what they need. They need more education. They need more work opportunity. They need their communities to support them more. I'm not sure that I understand the question. I think that the people who are on the edge want what we're talking about more than anybody else in the world.
I completely agree, and I phrased it poorly. Perhaps the question is, people are so busy trying to get by, they can't think the big thoughts that we can think in this room.
The policymakers need to think these thoughts. The foundation leaders need to think these thoughts. Our politicians need to think these thoughts. They're the ones who are controlling the narrative. You need to think these thoughts. You're controlling the narrative, and then we're trying to change it.
This is what you call setting myself up. You ready? Watch. Are you satisfied that's happening?
Oh, no. That's the thing that worries me the most.
It's a freebie, right? I had to give her the freebie.
It worries me the most that we don't have a collective narrative that draws us all together for the future and includes a narrative about what it is that we must do collectively to make the nation strong again.
Part of the problem that we have for the group that you were talking about in your question is that time literally is their enemy, right? Time is something that they can ill afford to waste. So living day to day, barely getting by, that's part of the narrative of society today. One of the challenges that we have in terms of this opportunity gap, right, which is about skills, which is about the educational attainment, is that we have these inefficiencies in our educational system. And one of the realities we know about our educational system is it takes too long for people to get a post-high school education. They have work obligations, they have family obligations, the systems are not set up to bring them through efficiently. The average time to a college degree in this country for a bachelor's degree is over 5 years for what was supposed to be a 4-year degree. It takes very long for people to get associate's degrees. Many of them do not finish. So time is their enemy. Figuring out how we deliver high-quality, learning-based education in the most reasonable amount of time so that people can get to work and get on with their life is really important. That's a part of the narrative that I don't think we've confronted, because what we've said is, we'll give you an opportunity, we'll give you a chance. We have to do more than give them a chance. We need to give them the pathway to get there in the most reasonable amount of time that's possible so that they can actually improve their own quality of life and therefore, to Angela's point, improve our collective well-being.
You know, I don't know if you read the LA Times yesterday, but there are Cal State students either here in town or somewhere else in the state who are going to go on hunger strike to protest the rising cost of education, the lack of access to classes that they need, and high pay for education officials. What do you do with that? I mean, how do you control those things that are making these students so desperate? Can we control those things?
We have a long-term problem in our educational system. Let's be candid. It's an inefficient system. The productivity, which is a word that people in higher education hate, it's a word that implies somehow that there are nefarious market forces that are trying to influence what they're doing, when in fact the system is simply too inefficient to deliver the amount of learning that we need given our goals as a society. So the cost issue is now the point of the spear. The issue that we now are trying to address here is we can no longer deliver this kind of education at that price to the same group of people that we've been delivering it to for 40 years. Educational attainment, post-high school attainment, essentially hasn't moved for 40 years in the United States. What's happening in the rest of the world? South Korea, Canada, and a dozen other countries have now exceeded our post-high school educational attainment rates, while we have essentially vibrated in place. The problem is the cost is too expensive. How do you get around that? You stop delivering it the way you've been delivering it historically and start delivering it in a new way.
Well, explain that a little bit. How do you do it? Walk me through it.
Well, so lots of ways.
Give me a couple.
Yeah, the first is, let's use technology to better deliver what we know technology can deliver on already. Technology is not the panacea to all of our problems. Carnegie Mellon University has a large-scale experiment going on right now where they're delivering general education classes, all types of general education classes, using very advanced technological means. The kicker here is they can do it in 50% of the time and achieve higher levels of learning outcomes. This is one of America's premier learning institutions in the country. If we could consolidate and truncate the general education experience so that gets much shorter, we can deliver a 4-year degree in 4 years, maybe 3 years. We can start delivering education to people at the associate level who need both technical skills as well as those generalizable critical thinking, communication, and problem-solving skills much more rapidly. We have an experiment that we've supported in Indiana, which is an 11-month associate degree for high-risk high school graduates. What we do is we essentially pay them to go to school. We say, this is your job. Your job for the next year is to get that associate degree. They go to school 9 to 4 every day. They get a stipend to live on, and we give them a articulated pathway to get from here to there. That's the value proposition for them. If you say to that young person who's living on the edge, go to college and in 4 or 6 or 11 years you might get a credential, there's no way. Yeah. If you say to them, we can give you skills and give you a marketable skill that gets you into the labor market in 11 months, that's something they can relate to.
Angela, to Jim's earlier point about time and time being the enemy, do you agree with that?
Oh, I do. I do. Time is the enemy for all of us. Things are coming very rapidly. We are in a rapidly changing, rapidly moving society. And the problems that we're talking about are going to really disable us as a nation if we don't get on top of this very quickly. Time really is a problem. I want to just go back to the conversation you were just having and ask, if I could, about dipping down more into high school and connecting people in high school more to careers. Part of the problem is we have to overcome a prejudice in communities of color because vocational education was a bad thing. We have to help people to understand that the kinds of careers that are available are careers that take you into the middle class, but the same preparation that you need for a four-year education is what you need for that. Say a word about the high school.
That's absolutely right. You know, I think we all know what the problems are in terms of our high schools, which is we lose a huge number of people between the ages of 16 and 18 because that value proposition for them just isn't clear. So
hang on one second. Who are those 16 to 18-year-olds? They're not the upper middle class white kids, right?
They are overwhelmingly low income, and they are students of color, and a significant proportion of them are individuals whose parents have no high school education, or haven't completed a high school education.
Okay, sorry, I interrupted. Go ahead.
And boys.
So, and a disproportionate number of them are boys.
Males, yeah.
So, rethinking that time period, that transitional period, is really important. To me, what our K-12 system, we use this phrase now for about the last decade. It's about college readiness. Really, it's about making sure that students aren't ready for college, meaning some sort of post-high school education, but actually have a pathway so that it takes them all the way through to a credential that gets them into the labor market. The educational system has resisted this idea that the critical outcome of an education is a job. If you talk to, unfortunately, too many people in higher education, they continue to say, we don't train people for jobs, we train them for life. Wow. Our argument is...
How's that life going without a job?
Our argument is, it's the same thing. The same skills that you need to be a productive citizen, to be a contributor to our society, are the skills you need in a job. And they're the same skills that employers say they want. Those critical thinking and problem-solving
Angela, go ahead.
capacity.
So we're more than a decade into the 21st century now, and our policies haven't even begun to catch up with it. Schools are the classic. They are just so outmoded in terms of time in school, the way we think about education. We've got to really get on speed up, getting back to your notion of time. Foundations can help us get on speed up. They need to speed up themselves. They need to speed up themselves. They need to figure out...
I'm not the only one she's yelling at.
But where are the challenges? Where are the challenges? How do we equip the organizations that can really begin to move fast into the 21st century? How do we begin to help communities come back? You know, poverty's changed. We have more poor people living in the suburbs than we have in the cities. What are foundations doing to be able to equip those communities to support people who are poor? And how are they making sure that people who live in cities can stay there and enjoy them as they're transforming? There are a lot of 21st century issues that we're not on.
So why do we lack this urgency, right? Because these problems or opportunities, however you want to phrase it, are so clear and stark, and yet, you know, you have to fill out 14 forms and have a meeting and this and that and all this stuff. And I mean, how do you do the speed up?
I don't know why we lack the urgency. I feel it so deeply. I don't know why we lack the urgency. We are disconnected, though. The disconnection that we have in this country causes us not to feel the urgency when it's out there. But this recession has actually brought it home to so many people. Just think about the housing bubble. Black and Latino families were losing their houses long before it hit the front pages of the newspapers. If we had paid attention then, if we had had a sense of connection, there would have been urgency about that. Already, the March figures, unemployment in the black community is over 14%. It's over 10% in the Latino community. It was over 10% long before it got double-digit in the country. Why did we not have urgency? Because we're not connected. We don't understand what happens to others also happens to us.
History is also a problem for us, right? Because in addition to that point, look, we had the greatest economy in the world. We had the greatest educational system in the world.
Past tense.
Definitely past tense. I'm not convinced that we are there anymore in either of those cases. So we've convinced ourselves that all we need to do is keep doing what we were doing and everything will be fine. Keeping doing what we were doing isn't going to get us ahead anymore. Not when the Chinese economy is growing at 3 or 4 times the rate of our economy. Not when virtually every one of our economic competitors is investing in education at multiples of what we're investing in. We've got to do a much, much better job.
Can I
chime in, and then I got a question for you. Go ahead.
So I mean, one thing that I think is worth noting is the problems we're seeing they're very widespread. But what's also happened over the past 20 or 30 years, we've seen a really unprecedented geographical sorting of Americans by education, by economic potential, with the highest potential people, the wealthiest people, moving disproportionately to a relative handful of power cities, creative enclaves. And I live in one of those enclaves, D.C., kind of the professional quarters of D.C., and I've got to say, there's no recession apparent there.
Right.
And I think that is, really a large part of the problem. And I was talking, in the course of my reporting, I was recently talking to a conservative political analyst who I can't name, but he said,
just us. Come on.
But he said. And I was talking about this period, and whether I was asking him, what he thought, and whether there would be kind of whether Occupy and other kind of populist movements, of the left, would kind of rise up, and what that would mean. And he said, Don, you're talking as if like political instability and populism would be kind of something bad that would happen to the country potentially because it could create a lot of instability. He said, I would submit to you that the more likely thing and the far worse thing is that it'll never get traction, and the top 20% of the country will just keep gliding upwards, and the bottom 80% will take it. And I think that's what we need to figure out how to address today. There's a real separation occurring, and we need to figure out how to engage that top 1%, top 10%, top 20%, more actively and more fully.
Yeah. On this issue of time and urgency and need to act now, how do you reconcile that? And this is a little bit of a meta question. How do you reconcile that with the fact that this recession has been so slow to end and the turning of the corner has taken so long?
Well, I mean, how do I reconcile it?
Yeah. I don't know that you can. Right?
I don't know that you can, but a major theme of my reporting is that we always underestimate the costs of periods like this one because we think of them as, when they end, they're over, and that's just not true because when people are out of work for 3 or 4 years, they seldom find their way back into a job again. It's very hard for them to do that. When people are in their early 20s and can't find a good job for 5 years, they don't recover fully. So the consequences of periods like this are longer than we tend to think.
Yeah.
And if you look at Europe, I mean, the U.S. has not had a problem of highly elevated unemployment for many years. Europe has in the 80s and 90s, and there's an economic term for what happens. It's called hysteresis. The unemployment rate rises and stays high even once the economy recovers because people who've been out of work for so long become invisible. We need to add urgency to everything we're doing because the costs of this period are longer lasting and are bigger than we think they are.
It's actually interesting. That word hysteresis is actually now being bandied about in the popular press, which means, economists have been talking about it for years, and now the commentators are picking up on it. Let's bring the house lights up, and if you guys have some questions, I have another couple, obviously, for the panel. But if you've got questions, there are microphones here, and please step up, and we'll get you involved. Don, if history's a guide, we will not be out of this. The effects of this recession will not have dissipated before the next one starts. Am I right?
Not completely, no.
Yeah. So I am right that it will not have dissipated. That's
the economy. If you look at the top line economic growth, it might be great. If you look at Silicon Valley, things might be that things might be going very, very well.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you look at kind of the unemployment rate, and then if you just look at the effect on people, the unemployed, many communities throughout the U.S., yes, it will take decades for the effects of this period to fully diminish.
Could I
Yes,
point
ma'am.
out one thing? That foundations actually sit in the best position to be able to help with this problem of any other sector that I can imagine. Because you have so many people on your boards and many on your staffs who have a huge walkabout within the privileged communities of society. And because of the work that you do and fund, you know more about what's happening in communities where people are being left behind than the average person within your social circle and within your neighborhoods. And so being able to lift that up as an asset that you don't often talk about is an asset that we need now more than ever. We have to help the American people see that the future is in jeopardy, but it's within our hands, within our power to change it. And the kinds of things that you're funding and that we're talking about need public and political will. And one way to start to build it is to just talk more about what you're learning here and ask questions.
Speaking of asking questions, I can't believe nobody out there actually has one. So step on up to the microphone. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ginny Galisa now. And I love, Jamie, your program where you're providing support to children and young adults and scholarships. And the area that I'm really concerned about is that invisible crowd, the people who are in their 50s, who have lost their jobs, who have high school diplomas, yet they don't know how to go back to school, nor do they have the time, nor do they have the money. And I'm not aware of a number of programs that actually provide those same scholarship, learning, retraining opportunities for that 50-year-old crowd who are not ready to retire and don't have that time and money and need scholarships.
Yeah.
So, great question. To Don's point from earlier in the program about the fact that in this recession, unlike any of the other prior recessions, it's pretty clear that the jobs that were lost aren't coming back. Those are the individuals that you're talking about. Those are the individuals that we really need to be paying attention to. It is both morally and economically stupid for us to write those people off.
Yeah.
And so it's going to be very important for us to shift our education system to increasingly serve their needs. It's a problem. It's a problem because policymakers and others tend to think of an educational system as primarily serving young people. It's got to serve those people equally as well, because you've got people in their 30s and their 40s and their 50s, in your example, who have many years of productive work life left, who are probably going to be relegated to low-skill, low-wage jobs when, in fact, they were earning a middle-class wage, and they were a part of the middle class in the old economy. In the new economy, they're not going to have that. Community colleges play a major role. There's no coincidence of the fact that you've seen a lot more focus on community colleges in the last couple of years. But I think there's a bigger issue here, which is a broader collaboration of industry-based credentialing, community colleges, and I would say new providers, that is technologically-based providers that can serve those individuals, because for them, the time issues are even more severe than they are for many of the young people.
Sir.
Hi,
You
I'm Kevin
break it,
Walker.
you buy it.
I'm Kevin Walker from the Northwest Area Foundation, and I want to thank you all. This has been a fascinating conversation. Angela, I think we all recognize that you got the most applause for comments like the notion that equity is our best competitive strategy going forward. I certainly agree with that. I think many of us do. I'm struck by Jamie's comment, though, that when you're on the Hill, I think the words you used, Jamie, were, they don't believe us.
Yeah.
My question is, what's the answer to that conundrum?
Right.
Making the same point even more passionately probably isn't the right strategy. And I'm curious, in terms of message, in terms of pushing these ideas forward to those who simply don't believe that narrative, how do we make a change there?
It's a great question. Angela, why don't you take it first? I want to hear both of you on this one, actually.
Most of you probably saw Manuel Pastor on the opening day. And Manuel Pastor's organization at USC and PolicyLink have actually joined and created a partnership to be able to bring together the research base underneath the assertion about equity being the superior growth model, so that we can begin to lay out scenarios. What happens to the nation in terms of jobs and employment if we don't invest, and what happens if we do? We feel that we need a lot more evidence. We need a lot more stories supported by examples of what is the right way to go and what the consequences are. Talking about this, the PG&E Power Pathway, which you probably all know about, is a wonderful example to be able to lift up what they're doing in terms of identifying what they need and helping community colleges to provide it. So your answer is evidence and evidence-based narrative.
Jamie, same question.
Elevating what works is very important. I think we have a responsibility in philanthropy. I think we've got capacity to help better elevate what works and shine the spotlight on what works. The other part, which is harder, is shine a spotlight on what doesn't work and stop doing it. And from a government policy perspective, that is really difficult to do. Let me tell you, I spent 25 years of my life in Washington, D.C. before I joined the foundation 5 years ago. And the hardest thing to do is to kill a program, to stop doing something that there's a constituency for. And that is a real problem in a world where government's capacity is constrained. That is, on the assumption that we're not going to have massive new tax inflows in terms of our system to pay for some of these things. With the amount of resources we do have, we're going to have to stop doing something. And that's part of our responsibility, is to make the case for what does work and also to be candid about what doesn't.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. My name is Shirley Fredricks from the Welk Foundation. You have not mentioned the role of Wall Street in this current period. Could you tell us, and we all know that Wall Street was the only beneficiary of this period, could you tell us what now might be some possible responsibilities that they could have to restore our country? Thank you.
The best part of being a moderator is I get to say, Don?
Yeah, no, Wall Street's behavior and the regulation of Wall Street, prior to the crash were a huge cause of the crash. And the questioner is exactly right. I mean, Wall Street got bailouts, the middle class did not, homeowners really did not. So it was a big part of the problem. I mean, I think going forward, it's also been a problem, I think, that Wall Street has really kind of absorbed a lot of the more talented people in the U.S., over the past 20 years who might otherwise have become entrepreneurs or gone into other sectors. I think the government has moved in the right direction in trying to kind of basically increase capital commitments, reduce leverage, maybe in some sorts of ways tie pay to longer-term horizons. I think these are the right things to do. I don't think the government has gone far enough, and I do think that at least as far as avoiding the next crisis, we need a more fundamental reform of Wall Street so that risk-taking isn't so cavalier, and so that we can minimize the chance of another crash, because as we see, these periods are just enormously destructive.
And lasting.
And lasting, yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Ryan from the Schooner Foundation, and I live in D.C., so I feel like I can take umbrage with your remark that D.C. is a creative enclave, because I personally feel like this is where ideas, it's where ideas sort of go to die, or at least good ideas these days. So, and I live there. So
no disagreement there.
But there were two things besides actually Wall Street, which was a good point, that I haven't heard in this conversation that I was wondering if people could talk about. And one is, in my opinion, green jobs are the way to sort of move us out of the recession that we're in, and no one sort of talked about that specifically. But also campaign finance reform, and how, as a philanthropic community, we need to, I think, dive more deeply into sort of the role of money in politics and corporations. And to me, those are sort of two of our pathways out, and for people to stay in the middle class. And I was wondering if any of them could, the speakers could comment.
Let me split that and ask you, Jamie, about education as a way to develop sustainable technologies and green jobs in this economy, because the president talked about it on the campaign trail. He's out there every now and then saying we got to do this.
Yeah, there's lots of examples out there of where we can demonstrate that we can actually do that. You do well and you do good. So that's a good thing. The problem is many of those green jobs are in areas that take a long time to build that infrastructure. And the reward system that we have in our country is the reason why we have to the prior question, the Wall Street problem, is that the rewards for those kind of jobs are much more immediate. Yeah. So one of the challenges I think we have is to figure out how to invest in things that have these long-term rewards that we think are scalable. Right now, the green jobs, the economies, the green job economies are chugging along. They continue to grow, but they're not growing at nearly a fast enough rate in order to make up for the gaps that we have in terms to bring that unemployment rate down. Over time, that investment is going to pay off pretty significantly for us, but with election cycles and the like, it's very difficult to sustain those kind of investments.
Yeah. Do either of you have a very quick thought on campaign finance? It's a little bit outside the topic of this conversation, but if you don't, we'll get to another question.
Go ahead.
Very quickly, go ahead.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I talked about this geographic separation in the U.S., and what scholars have found as well is that the rich, I mean, we all know this, but I mean, scholars have found it very strongly. Policies respond to the desires of the rich, not to the desires of the poor. Yeah. And so I think when we talk about building a stronger nation and a stronger middle class, we desperately need campaign finance reform so that a small group of people doesn't wield such enormous influence over our politics. I think that's central.
I agree.
Yes, ma'am. This will be the last one. Go ahead.
Hi, Lisa Parker from the Lawrence Welk Family Foundation. Shortly after I checked into the hotel on Sunday, I heard a woman screaming for help. And outside my door, she was being beaten. If ever there was a stark reminder of why we're here, I think that was it. Of course, I'm a lifelong advocate for women and the empowerment of women and girls. We know that investing in them changes the course of a family, but I think we have lost sight of our men and boys. And I'd like to know specifically from the panel how we as funders can include men and boys in our conversations and in our funding so that they are not forgotten in this equation.
Angela?
There are two funders that we're involved with at PolicyLink, the California Endowment, and their Boys and Men of Color project. And one of the main things they're focusing on is doing something about push-out, because this cradle-to-prison pipeline really gets on speed up when young boys in school get pushed out at very early ages, and then they often fall out of the system and don't come back up until they're in the criminal justice system. So we really do have a foundation that's developing a thoughtful strategy. The other foundation we're involved with is the Open Society Foundation, a Black Male Achievement Initiative, in which they're really looking at black boys and black men in particular, and looking at all the strategies that can make a difference. I think we're really building a wonderful body of knowledge about how to be able to actually look at the particular plight of boys and men of color. In many ways, they are the litmus test in community. The litmus test as to whether or not your strategy is working is whether or not those who are most forgotten and so important are getting any benefit. It's never a strategy that leaves out girls and women. It actually is very inclusive of them, but the good news is we're learning a lot. I'd love to talk with you more.
Let me take the moderator's prerogative and ask the last question. We are time limited, so it's a tricky question, but you need to be brief about it. Are you, on balance, hopeful about where things are going? Jamie, you first.
I'm of course optimistic, because I think we've got the conditions now for which the only pathway is up. I think it's
whoa.
It's hard to envision the challenges getting worse. So, though I did want to make a point, which is I had a sort of strange sense when I heard Don talking about the upper 20% and the gap with the lower 80%. That reminds me of apartheid South Africa and all the things that I saw in my time working in South Africa over the course of several years. I don't think American society will stand for getting to that point, but it can happen, and I think it's worth pointing out. But I am optimistic, because I believe that American innovation has been one of our greatest assets, and it continues to be, even if we no longer are the biggest economy, the largest population, et cetera, in the world. And I think we've got a lot of potential for the future, but we've got to focus on that innovative capacity right now to change our educational system, right now to change the nature of work, or we are going to be in much more serious trouble.
Angela Blackwell.
I am extremely hopeful, and I will become more hopeful if you join with me in beginning to define the urgency in the ways that we've been talking about. For the first time in my adult life, all the issues are on the table. All the issues are on the table, and they're on the table in a way that it's not about them, it's about us. We have to define it that way. If we can stop thinking that the past was good and the future is scary, and understand that from the past we learned many lessons that we can apply to a future that is inevitable. We are becoming a nation in which the majority of people will be people of color. They can no longer continue to be left behind. No one can be left behind, or the nation will be left behind. That insight makes me hopeful. It's everybody's issue now.
Don Peck.
No, I agree with that. I mean, I think that this period has shown us very starkly who's being left behind in the U.S. today. And it's not a particular race. It's not a particular geography. It extends across races. It extends across geographies. It is much of the nation. And I'm hopeful that the clarity that provides will provide something transformative in our government, in our foundational work. I'm pessimistic about the next 4 or 5 years because I think that history does show us and our current politics show us that it's just awfully hard to get something done when the economy is struggling so badly. But I think it's really important to keep doing the work during that period because that work, even if it seems unproductive, can create something transformational, a few years out.
I thank you all for your time. Karen Yanis, where are you? Come on up.
Thank you. Thank you. One of the biggest benefits of the Council is the opportunity to network and to get to know your peers. And chairing the Scrivener Committee for Creative Grantmaking allowed me to do that. It allowed me to work with some really wonderful people outside of their own comfort zones to think not only about best in class in their portfolios, but best in class across the sector. So I want to thank the Scrivener Committee for working with me. The Award for Creative Grantmaking honors an individual who's demonstrated outstanding creativity in their grantmaking and who, with a combination of vision, principle, and personal commitment, are making a critical difference in a creative way. The award is a memorial to the creative legacy left to the field by Robert W. Scrivener, a longtime director of the Rockefeller Family Fund. The award is accompanied by $10,000 in cash for the recipient's ongoing professional enrichment and development in the field of grantmaking. The 2012 award recipient is Theopolis Gregory, Senior Vice President of El Pomar Foundation in Colorado Springs. Theo oversees community outreach activities on behalf of the foundation. He was the primary architect and champion of El Pomar's Emerging Leaders Development Program, which began in 2001, to help develop the wealth of diverse leadership potential within southern Colorado. The program identifies and encourages current and emerging ethnic minority leaders to embrace broad-based community involvement, civic engagement, and service on boards and commissions. The program is a collaborative effort among El Pomar, community leadership development programs in Colorado Springs, and Pueblo, and minority-focused community organizations. Please join me in welcoming Theo Gregory.
Good morning, everyone. All right. And believe it or not, this is a career milestone and defining moment for me. And it's a time to be thankful, it's a time to be humble, but it's also a time to reflect, and reflect upon that question that I asked when the task force called me on the phone. What did I do to deserve this? I had no idea. But let me start by saying thank you so much to the Council on Foundation's Board of Directors, as well as Karen Yanis, Evelyn Gibson, Renee Branch, and members of the selection task force for your appreciation and recognition for the work that I do for El Pomar Foundation. For more than 27 years, the Council has administered the Robert Winston Scrivener Award Fund and selected 31 civic-minded professionals whose vision, personal commitment made a difference. And I believe, as just Robert Scrivener illustrated in his lifetime, innovation, creative ways to enhance grant-making is fueled by humility, passion, energy, enthusiasm, knowing that we are a part of something bigger than ourselves. What makes it happen is leadership, and the time devoted to many causes and organizations, as well as the commitment to the journey of others. Specifically, the work I do on a daily basis provides me with the opportunity to interact with civic-minded, talented, diverse individuals and leaders who are truly committed to making a difference. And also along the way, I've learned some lessons. I've had some lessons learned over the past decade. And the first one is, your word is your bond. You must lead with the right values: respect, integrity, teamwork, trust, and excellence. Compassion and results-driven leadership fosters accountability and hope. And it's important to surround yourself with good people and, in turn, generously give them credit and credit your associates for their guidance, insight, and support. I am very fortunate to be a part of an organization that is forward-thinking and innovative. El Pomar Foundation trustees are always looking for new and different ways to make the impact in the state of Colorado. For more than 2 decades, the foundation has enhanced its grant-making through community stewardship programs, and they have trained young leaders for nonprofit careers, identified and rewarded the highest-performing nonprofits, and brought civic-minded community members together to learn about important issues and to take action. What I do is I try to cultivate, identify, and find opportunities to convene people who want to be leaders and make a pathway for their leadership opportunity to the place where the community needs them to be. I've never worked or been involved in the traditional grant-making process in the sense that we understand. The grant is from El Pomar Foundation trustees to the communities of Colorado, which provides me the privilege of meeting all the people we must have as leaders and doing whatever is needed to get them in that place of leadership. I am humbled by the nomination of the Council of Foundations Committee on Inclusiveness Chairperson Mei Hung. I am truly honored and blessed being selected as the 2012 winner of the Scrivener Award for Creative Grant Making. And again, if I may, thanks to the Council for honoring me with this prestigious award, and thank you for the good work you do. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Vicki Spruill.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to Kai and that wonderful panel. It was sobering but inspiring. Congratulations to Theo, and thank you too to Karen, who's going to be hosting our 2013 conference in Chicago. I am so happy to be here this morning at our annual conference. Listen to me saying our, not quite, but almost. I arrived on Sunday afternoon, and I have had the great good fortune of meeting with many of you in private sessions and in the hallways and in so many different presentations. Thank you so much for your warm and your generous welcome. I received hugs in the hallway before I ever even checked into the hotel, and I appreciate that so much. I want to recognize Jeff Clark and his superior leadership during this interim period for the Council on Foundations. He's making my job a whole lot easier, and I am forever grateful. Thank you, Jeff. I also want to thank the board for giving me this remarkable opportunity for a new adventure in my career. This has been a remarkable event, and I also want to thank Jim Canales and the whole team. This is going to be a tough act to follow, but we can do it. The energy at this event and in this room and throughout all of the sessions has really been palpable. When I look around this room, it is so plain for me to see the power and the promise and the potential of philanthropy, and I can hardly wait to start working with all of you. I genuinely feel a calling to this field of philanthropy, where I did some of my most exciting and early work. And I'm honored to be here at this, I think, unique and very special moment in time when philanthropy is needed now more than ever. As our panel reminded us, and this was just perfect timing, government budgets are in the red, societal demands and concerns are rising at a fever pitch, and it's philanthropy that can provide some of these innovative solutions and thinking and facilitating solutions to help address all of these critical issues that so many of you in this room have dedicated your lives to solving. This is a unique moment in time to elevate the significance of philanthropy, and it's because of each of you in this room and because of the Council on Foundations and the way we're positioned that we can work together to do this important work. If there's one theme that I've been hearing in my conversations with many of you, it's that the Council on Foundations is a crucial organization for the field of philanthropy. The Council's members, those of you in this room again, represent the most respected, the most innovative, and the most influential grant makers in the field of philanthropy today. And it's that very diversity and that very richness of this membership and your individual and your collective actions and work that best illustrates the importance and, dare I say, the relevance and value of philanthropy in action. So I have some early roots in philanthropy, but it's really, I think, my work on the grantee side of the equation, most recently leading Ocean Conservancy, that is giving me, I hope, a fundamental understanding and an important perspective on philanthropy in terms of the problems that we're trying to solve, in terms of the impact that we're making, in terms of the lives that we're changing. All of the hallmark programs at Ocean Conservancy have been dependent on and have been inspired by and created through very close collaborations, true partnership really, with a variety of kinds of donors. Frankly, I think having been on the grantee side of the equation helps put the philanthropic side of the equation in perspective. I truly see the value of philanthropy in terms of the impact that it has, not just the wealth and the dollars that you represent. So in the weeks and months ahead, I look forward to listening to and to learning from hopefully every single one of you in this room, and to bringing my very best thinking and perspective to the Council. This is truly the time to seize the opportunity and for us to amplify the role that philanthropy has in America today. So let's make some waves. I have just a quick administrative note, and this is a little bit of an awkward segue, but for those of you who are traveling today, there are news reports that LAX, the airport, is going to have some extra security delays for the Bin Laden anniversary, as well as the May Day demonstrations by organized labor. So the advisories are to allow yourselves a little extra time. So I just wanted to make sure you're all aware of that. Again, thank you for coming and traveling to LA. This has been quite an experience, an onboarding gift for me, and I look forward to working with all of you. Thank you.